As someone born in the 1980s, I don't really have a lot of memories of that time period. Most of my childhood memories come from the early 90s, and they're a weird mix of 90s properties like the Batman, Spider-Man, and X-Men animated series, the Animaniacs, Tiny Toon Adventures, and things like the Power Rangers, combined with reruns or recordings of 80s series. I'm talking stuff like G.I. Joe, He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, Thundercats, Care Bears, and of course, the Transformers. I can't remember which came first for me, playing with the toys undoubtedly bought by my mom from yard sales, or watching reruns of the cartoons, but my love for Transformers hit deep. I loved the art of transforming the toys and figuring out how to do it without instructions. I loved the profiles that were on the back of the packaging. I can clearly remember standing inside of Rite Aid, which was the 90s equivalent of a CVS or a Walgreens where I lived, and I would just read the back of each Transformer, absorbing every piece of lore. And of course, I loved that lore. Autobots versus Decepticons for the fate of two worlds, rivalries and histories between all of the various characters. All of it stimulated my imagination and captured my mind. When I would be sitting in the car, gazing out of the backseat window, I would imagine other cars we passed transforming. What did their robot mode look like? How did they fit into the world of Transformers? Although I didn't know it at the time, the Transformers were probably the first thing that I wrote fanfic about. Not that I ever actually wrote any fanfic about Transformers, but just, as a kid, letting my imagination wander. Transformers the movie, the animated one, was a huge thing for me as well. I remember borrowing the VHS tape from our local library and crying in shock when Optimus Prime died. I fell in love with Hot Rod, who evolved over the course of the movie into Rodimus Prime, obviously. And he's probably where my love and fascination with replacement characters come from, now that I think about it. While I was sad to lose Optimus, don't get me wrong, I was more than willing to accept Hot Rod when I watched Transformers the animated movie. But I also only ever got part of the Transformers story. TV shows back then were random occurrences to me. Back in my childhood, the only way to learn about TV programming was to buy a TV Guide magazine, so I rarely knew what was on or when it would air or what channel it would be on. We also barely got TV at all where I lived when I was a kid. We got like 4 channels, 3, 5, 8, and 64, which was PBS, 8 was Fox, and then 3 and 5 were ABC and or CBS. I'm not sure which was which. So sometimes we would just have moments where a specific channel just wouldn't come in. I remember religiously watching The Simpsons at 8 p.m. on Sunday nights, except for nights when The Simpsons didn't come in, and that channel just didn't exist for me. So what channel did Transformers air on when I was a kid? When did it air? Where did it air? Man, floop if I knew. And when I did catch Transformers, it's not like they were being played in chronological order anyways. As much as I enjoyed the cartoon and the lore of the action figures, I never actually got to sit down and watch the whole show until the mid-2000s, when they were finally released on DVD and I made my own money and I could just buy the whole run. Before that, all I had was the occasional VHS tape, random reruns on TV, and of course, a couple of comic books. The Transformers' first comic book series was actually licensed to Marvel Comics in 1984, which would run until 1991, which was several years before I would start actually buying comic books. I did read a few odd issues of that series owned by my best friend Dan, but I never bought those books myself. Oddly enough, the Transformers comics never felt like they were part of the cartoon to me. They never felt canon, even back then when I was probably like 12 or 13 and didn't really understand what that concept meant. The comics did not match the cartoons that I had seen, or the movie that I loved, and ultimately I was left confused and wanting. And, to be honest, the art in those comics did absolutely nothing for me. To me, they are some of the ugliest books I've ever looked at from the mid-90s, which are notorious for having some bad artwork. It wasn't until 2002 that a new volume of Transformers was launched, this time by Dreamwave Studios. And I got in on the ground floor. My name is Ben, and this is Comic Book Breakdown episode 21.1, Dreamwave's Transformers. Dreamwave Studios first launched as an imprint of Image Comics, founded by artist Pat Lee and his brother Roger Lee. It was actually Pat Lee's artwork that originally caught my attention. Lee was one of the first anime/manga-inspired artists that I ran into after Joe Mad on Uncanny X-Men. Where Mad's work felt animated and lively, where his humans might not be realistic, but they felt real, Pat Lee's humans never quite looked right. They're an odd mix of realistic body shapes and faces without much shading and with these kind of blank facial expressions. If you're familiar with the anime/manga Initial D, Lee's faces remind me quite a bit of the artist of that series, Shuichi Shigeno. But combined with some expertly done digital coloring and comic books that were outside of the usual superhero spectrum, Lee quickly built himself a nice library of titles. There was the cyberpunk Dark Minds, the fantasy epic Warlands, its Asian-inspired spin-off Shidima, and eventually, when Lee launched Dreamwave, his company acquired the license to several notable properties. I'm talking series like Mega Man, Devil May Cry, the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the Transformers. For me, Lee's humans never really worked. His renditions of the Transformers, though, were exactly what I wanted. They were all big and blocky, their colors bright like the cartoon, and they felt right. All of the Transformers in what few Marvel comics that I read looked off-model, poorly colored, and kind of rushed. They looked like the artist had been trained to draw people, but then was hired to draw a comic book starring large robots. Pat Lee's Transformers looked like he had drawn them all of his life, but this was the first time that he had been paid to do it. They looked like they stepped out of the animated movie to me. They were glorious. With improved visuals and a better understanding of continuity and how it worked, Dreamwave's Transformers was the first licensed comic that I ever bought, and I haven't read it in almost 2 decades. Over the course of its existence, Dreamwave would publish 2 6-issue Transformer miniseries before launching them into an ongoing series that would unfortunately only last for 10 issues. They also published a variety of spin-off comics, including Transformers Micromasters, Transformers Armada, Transformers Energon, crossover comics with fellow 80s darling G.I. Joe, and a few titles that were set in Cybertronian history like The War Within, The Dark Ages, and The Age of Wrath. Unfortunately, Dreamwave's success was short-lived. The license that Dreamwave had paid for, and they never actually fully paid Hasbro, by the way, the company that owns the Transformers intellectually, was only for distribution in the United States, forcing international distribution of Dreamwave's best-selling comic to grind to a halt. Why does this matter? Do overseas sales really matter that much to the American comic book industry? Well, no, but Dreamwave was based in Canada, dear listener, and thus the bulk of their orders would have been to the United States, making it international. In order to focus on the more successful licensed properties that they had acquired, Dreamwave's own original titles were either put on hold or outright canceled, limiting their output. In 2002, rumors started to float around that there were creators who weren't getting paid for their work. It's also said that artists were forced to draw in a, quote, house style similar to Pat Lee's, forcing artists to change their art styles even after having finished penciling pages. This basically meant drawing pages twice, or forcing the inker to drastically alter the pages from what was already on them. Around this time, Pat Lee started to do work for hire for Marvel and DC again, most likely needing a paying job. He and his brother began funneling what assets they could into a new company, Dream Engine, along with a variety of other controversial rumors. A number of Dreamwave writers were either fired or did work for little or no pay. A number of artists were either fired or did work for little to no pay or credit. Reading up on the allegations is honestly super depressing and disappointing, and it's a huge shame. Where CrossGen ended up dying because the money behind it got locked up in federal investigations, Dreamwave seems to have died just because of poor money management by its leadership. It published good books, and Transformers was a top-selling book when it first hit the stands, but none of that matters if the money coming in isn't used well. I have a lot of love for the work that was done at Dreamwave. I own trade paperbacks of Warlands and Shadima, if I remember correctly. I bought all of Sandscape. I've got an odd smattering of Dark Minds that I picked up at various dollar sales. And of course, I have all of the Transformers stuff that I wanted to buy. In 2005, Dreamwave declared bankruptcy. At this point, Hasbro had already declined renewing their contract with Dreamwave, allowing them to start shopping for a new home for their Transformers. Eventually, that license would go to IDW Publishing, who publishes a number of really well-received Transformer comics to this day. It was only maybe like a year or two ago that they rebooted their own continuity after several really well-done crossover events. But I'll always have a soft spot for Dreamwave's Transformers. Or at least, I hope that I do. As I was finishing up the Western streak of episodes, I started to mentally skim through my collection. What was I going to read for the show next? I had just done 20 episodes on a bunch of Marvel comics, so as far as I'm concerned, that was out. None of my DC books were really calling to me, and we had wrapped up CrossGen Scion earlier this year. I wanted something different, something unlike anything that we had covered up to this point. With that running in the background of my mind over the course of a couple of weeks, I happened to be watching Chris McFeely's Transformers The Basics on YouTube. Transformers The Basics is a series where the host, the aforementioned McFeely, does comprehensive deep dives on individual characters or concepts within the Transformers mythology. And watching those, it just clicked. I love this universe. I love these characters. And I haven't read the Dreamwave Transformers in probably close to 20 years. Plus, because of its relatively short life, we won't have to be here forever. That's beautiful. My current plan is to cover the first miniseries only, which is a preview issue, which I'll cover in the rest of this episode, and then an actual 6-issue miniseries. If I'm still feeling it when we finish this series out, I'll do the second. And if I'm really digging this stuff, then we'll cover the ongoing series. So'kay? So'kay. The Transformers Generation 1 preview issue opens somewhere in the Arctic. We see two figures trudging through knee-deep snow. They're both chonky-looking, dressed in layers of warm clothing and fur-lined hoods. One of the men, who we'll later learn is named Ratzenberg, pulls off his hat. You know, one of the ones with the flaps that fold down over your ears, and wipes at the sweat on his brow. He asks his companion his name. He says that they call him Lazarus. Okay, cool, Ratzenberg says. How do you like sports, Lazarus? He goes into a long-winded monologue about how there's two types of people in the world: football fans and baseball fans. Football fans enjoy not just the game and its man versus man nature, but also the fact that it's just man versus nature. If it rains, you play. If it snows, you play. If it's a blizzard outside, you still play. Well, Ratzenberg pauses, huffing and puffing from the exertion. Let me tell you, I hate football. Which is to say that this guy hates being out here. Lazarus better have a damn good reason for not just dragging him all the way out here, but for making him suffer this death march. This is not how you win over a client, you know? And if Ratzenberg dies from pneumonia before he can even see Lazarus' super secret operation, I mean, this whole thing is ridiculous. Lazarus barely replies, simply saying that they're almost there. He keeps walking. Ratzenberg struggles to catch up. he is being asked to invest over $2 million into whatever this project is. And this experience is not how to win him over. It's just, it's bad business, man. The investor catches up to Lazarus and grabs his shoulder. Are you even listening to me? In an eye blink, Lazarus grabs the man's hand, twists his arm, and drives him face first into the snow. Are you done? He asks the investor, who starts to snivel. Are you done? When he is, Lazarus lets him go. Good. He was getting sick of listening to his whining. Lazarus steps back, allowing Ratzenberg to find his feet on his own. Does Mr. Ratzenberg believe in second chances? Because Lazarus does. There's always an opportunity for a second chance, if you know where to look. Since Ratzenberg struggles to stand for a moment, Lazarus does finally offer him a hand. This whole operation that he's running out here, ultimately, it's all about second chances. They walk a bit more and crest an icy ridge. Below them, excavators and a crane are parked at the edge of a stone pit. As we zoom in, we can see men walking the perimeter, standing at banks of equipment that line one of the upper levels of the dig. As we zoom in, Lazarus tells Mr. Ratzenberg a story about how a race of warrior gods, of gladiators, came from the stars. They were faster than human race cars, bigger and stronger too. Some of them could even fly. But these were not even the most impressive of the gladiators' skills. No, it was their ability to change that made them gods. They could transform. In the pit, one of the men monitoring a computer goes over the information again. They've been digging for 8 hours, and we can see a laser being fired into the snowy ground behind him, melting it. They should have found it by now. By the edge of the laser pit, another man smiles. Bingo! They found it! Lazarus is contacted by radio and informed of the find. He and Ratzenberg continue their journey into the dig, and he continues his sales pitch. Imagine if we could have talked to those gods. The things that humankind might have learned, might have developed. How many important people across the globe would have loved to have aligned themselves with those gods? Think of it. All of the power at your side. Ratzenberg shakes his head. Yeah, all of that sounds good, but what does that mean to him? Lazarus pulls back his hood. He's a white guy, bland face, save for a scar that runs down over the left side of his left eye. His black hair is cut short and slicked back from his face. He looks like a tough guy / businessman, like maybe he should be running a mob family somewhere. He gestures at the pit, and Ratzenberg looks in. Mostly buried in the snow, just barely exposed, is a large robotic man. Its body is mostly blue with a window in its chest framed in yellow. A red eye visor, dull and inactive, stares out of its face. This is Soundwave, a transformer, specifically a Decepticon. And now, it belongs to Lazarus. He smiles. Thank God for second chances. Ratzenberg looks nervously at his host. Who should he make the check out to? Obviously, this is just meant to be a teaser for the larger Transformer series, and I gotta say, it works pretty well. It's dramatic AF, but who doesn't love some good drama? And it builds well, taking its time getting to the big reveal. We've got a lot to learn going into this story, what happened to the Transformers being the first and foremost thing in my mind. Clearly, something has happened, and at least Soundwave has been deactivated or temporarily turned off. But what about the rest of the Decepticons? Or the Autobots? We don't know yet, but this preview promises that we'll get there. The interactions between Lazarus and Ratzenberg are entertaining for the most part. Ratzenberg is the nervous, entitled, privileged wallet that hates getting his hands dirty and being in the field, which demonstrates how intriguing he must find Lazarus's project in order to be out here. But he's clearly uncomfortable, and that contrasts well with the main man himself, Lazarus. Lazarus' name is an indication of who he is as a person. The original Lazarus was a man who died in the Bible and was brought back to life by Jesus, a living example of second chances thanks to a belief in God. Here, Lazarus believes in a new set of gods, the Transformers, and he'll get some kind of second chance through them. What that chance is unclear as of yet, and what Lazarus originally failed at is also unknown. From a storytelling standpoint, I would guess that whatever he failed at before led to him getting that scar, though. He is a tough Subanovich, not blinking at the cold weather, and he is determined as he puts up with all of Ratzenberg's complaining. But he is also aware of the unique position that having control of a Transformer gives him. And when Ratzenberg finally pisses him off enough, he gets physical with him. This implies that he has some form of combat training. He didn't just shove Ratzenberg away, he employed some form of martial art to restrain him. So there's more to meets the eye with this character that I find promising. Tonally, this feels like the opening scene of a movie. I'm not sure how much research the writers of the live-action Michael Bay Transformers did on previous takes on the property, but this feels like it might have been used for the first one. Remember, that movie opens with explorers finding a Decepticon buried in Arctic ice, but there it was their leader, Megatron, and here we have their communications officer, Soundwave. But that is an interesting throwback that I had totally forgotten about. I bet that Michael Bay's group totally got that idea from these comics. I do wish that we had more Transformers in our Transformers preview comic, but this is a preview. Its whole purpose is that it's promising more to come. The franchise does have a history of teaming up human characters with the robots, so using them as our into a story is a pretty tried and true method for this franchise. The audience stand-in in this story is Ratzenberg, who is being asked to invest our interest in a fallen property, specifically the Transformers, who have been dormant in the world of comics for something like 6 or 8 years at this point. Lazarus, then, is Dreamwave, having gotten their hands on this cool, amazing no swearing, and now they are inviting us along on the adventure. This issue really echoes some of the work being done over at Marvel at the time as well, specifically with their Ultimate line of titles. Ultimate Spider-Man was an incredibly slow comic, allowing the reader to settle into the new world and continuity before making Peter Parker into Spider-Man. The first issue of that comic actually ends with just a single display of Peter's newfound abilities, his ability to stick to walls. You don't even get to see Spider-Man in the first issue of a comic book called Spider-Man. That sense of pacing, what we now call decompressed storytelling, works really well for settling the audience into an unknown world and focusing on your characters, and so it does work well for me here. Author Chris Saraceni wrote the preview and will go on to write the rest of the first miniseries. And I am having a lot of trouble finding any history on the man. He appears to have been born in Canada and then eventually, at some point, gotten hired to write this very comic. He did write a Dark Minds miniseries for Dreamwave called Macropolis, as well as another book called Fate of the Blade. He has since gone on to write several Street Fighter comic books for Udon, the only licensed property that I actually still buy in comic book form, when they actually publish something. He also has done a comic book called Casa Nostra, but I am absolutely unfamiliar with it. I did find an interview that introduces him as a screenwriter who has done work for Universal, Disney, and Nasser Entertainment, but I could not find any confirmation on what he specifically worked on. So other than the fact that this guy exists, and that he's from Canada, and that he wrote Transformer comics for Dreamwave, I don't know, and I can't find anything on Chris Saraceni. So if you know anything more than I do, feel free to let me know. The artwork was handled by Pat Lee, and he does a good job. His people look like people, and interestingly, Lee is not credited with drawing the backgrounds. There is a specific credit to Edwin Garcia for them, and this must have been a quick draw because 90% of those backgrounds is a snowy backdrop with maybe some mountains like way off in the distance. It does pair well with Lee's artwork, don't get me wrong, I am just tickled pink. I don't think I have ever seen a credit for just drawing backgrounds. That's so strange to me. Inks for the preview were done by Rob Armstrong, who uses a thick black line around the body of the characters and a much thinner one for the lines that make up the interior of the body. This really lends an animated feel to the artwork that I enjoy. After all, I was introduced to Transformers as a cartoon. I want it to look animated, so that works really well for me. The real star here is the coloring, which was done by The Real IT, with an exclamation point at the end. The human figures in this are mostly dark colors, swaddled in their clothes, which contrasts well with our gray, blue, and white backgrounds. The colors have really clear color separation. There is no blending or shading from one color into another. It is all hard lines, enhancing that animated feel, making it feel like it's a cartoon from the 80s or 90s. And you would think that an Arctic setting would just mostly be white backgrounds, but no. The Real IT, exclamation point, make sure to use blending and shading there, creating sharp, windswept crests in the snow or deep holes where the men were walking. Again, this also brings to mind the world of animation. Lots of cartoons have, or had, I suppose, back when things were animated on plastic cells, backgrounds that were static and painted. Plastic cells that then have the characters on them are laid over top of the background, and you can generally tell when an object in a scene is going to move, because it is painted differently from the background cell. It doesn't match the texture of the background, it matches the texture of the characters. That same concept is true here, where the background feels digitally painted, and it leans a lot more towards realism, while the humans are all brightly colored and feel much more animated. It really evokes that feel of this comic book being animated without it ever being animated at all, and it's kind of magical to me. If I have any complaint about the artwork overall, it's that things are very dark in this comic. It's like they colored Lazarus and Ratzenberg and then added several layers of black shading on top of them to make them feel less animated and more moody, realistic. I'm not exactly sure what they're going for there. It really contradicts the rest of the feel, like that idea of it being a brightly colored animation, but then it's a darkly colored animation instead. But I do have to say that it does add a sense of darkness and foreboding. Whatever these dudes are up to here, it really doesn't feel all that good. We also have a digital snow effect added to the artwork, and I like it. Snow can be kind of difficult to render in a comic book depending on how your art style works, but making it a digital effect allows them to just kind of slap it over every panel with relative ease. The snow even has a nice blur effect going on, making it feel like it's windy and it's blowing everywhere and these two men are really walking through a snowstorm. As a preview comic, we then have several pages of sketch artwork by Pat Lee and Guido Guidi in the back of the book. They range in their level of polish. Some of them are clearly sketches that end up being used as a comic book cover or a poster image later on down the line, while others are just practice. Given the tiny amount of Transformers that we got in the comic itself, it's nice to get a good look at them here, even if it's just visually and the faintest of tastes. One of the things that I'll note here about Dreamwave's Transformer comics is that every comic has at least 2 covers, one for the Autobots and one for the Decepticons. There are a variety of additional variants, but those 2 are your basic ones, and they are for every single comic. So if you are a completionist collector, man, do I feel bad for you. I would have still been shopping at Comic Book City back when these books first came out, and I would have kind of been forced to buy just whatever cover they still happened to have on hand. CBC did not order 1 million copies of every comic book. They kind of ordered 1 or 2 of everything, and if interest stayed around, they would order more, and if it didn't, they would just stop. So when I was able to choose a cover, I'm confident that I would have just picked whichever one had the characters that I liked more, but I don't think I had that option very often. You can't see it, but I just shrugged. I'm not a big fan of variant covers, as I would rather buy another comic book to read and not just to have, but I have to admit, I like the way that Dreamwave did this. Making each comic have a 50-50 split for the good guys and the bad guys is a great way to give each group a bit of a spotlight and moment to shine. Everyone has their favorite Transformer, and even amongst the Transformers, everyone has their favorite Autobot and their favorite Decepticon, and doing this allows Dreamwave appeal to as many shoppers as possible. It doesn't do much for me, personally, but I do like the idea of it. If you're going to do variants, this is kind of a good way to do it. While this was not the most thrilling opening to a comic book that I've ever read, the preview certainly sets a down-to-earth, realistic tone, and it tells us that it is going to take its time drawing us in, and I have to admit that I like that. Just, man, give me some more Transformers, alright? Next week, we learn what happened to the Transformers, and why they appear to be missing from this world. We will also meet Spike Witwicky, the human co-star from the cartoon, now a grown adult with his own son. And we learn Lazarus' plan for the Transformers. Join me in a week for Comic Book Breakdown episode 21.2, The Best Laid Plans. Everyone, there are a million podcasts vying for your time and attention, and I'd like to thank you for listening to mine. If you would like to get in touch with me, to share a concern, request a series, compliment me, berate me, whatever you like, send me an email at cbbreakdown@gmail.com. Otherwise, thanks for listening.